Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode number 127. My guest in this episode is Dr. James Cooke. James was a guest of mine about 2.5 years ago, and in this episode, he is coming on board to talk about his new book, or his forthcoming book, Dawn of Mind. I read the book, and I am general audience layperson. It was accessible to me. I have an interest in the matters of studies of consciousness and philosophy of mind and cognitive science and neuroscience, again from a general audience perspective. And the book was readable, accessible, and very engaging. He does a very good job at covering a lot of the conversations and arguments going on in the fields of consciousness research and philosophy of mind and cognitive science and neuroscience. I very much appreciate James coming on and having this conversation with me, because I think it's good for common folks like myself to be able to access some of what's going on in those dialogues out there related to consciousness. So, and my takeaway from the book was that he again offered a lot of perspective on what's going on, as well as some insights of his own that could lay down a roadmap for being able to reconcile some of these issues that occur in matters of consciousness. So big thanks to James, and I hope you all enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much to my subscribers. I appreciate you guys. And I'd like to welcome Dr. James Cooke back to the IdeaCast interview series. This is your second time on my show, James, and I'm really glad to have you here. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, I'm very, very glad to be back. I really enjoyed our last chat.
Well, I appreciate that, because I'm sort of a layperson, general audience guy, and not really educated. So that you enjoy being on my show it warms my heart. So thank you for that.
Yeah, the questions are excellent.
Oh, good. And I hope to continue that in this conversation. And to the audience, welcome. Glad to have you all here. In this conversation, we are going to be discussing James's forthcoming book, Dawn of Mind. And I say forthcoming, it is mid-October. And when is the release date of the book, James?
3rd of December in the US.
3rd of December. Okay, so available for pre-order now, though, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Now, what I will say as well to the audience, that I fully read the book. We were just joking about that but before we hit record. I read the book, and I would say in my takeaway from this book that James has done a wonderful job in making it palatable and available to a person like myself, general audience, layperson, no formal education, maybe bright enough to wrap their head around certain concepts, most importantly, an interest in philosophy of mind, cognitive science, neuroscience, etc. And so in the content of James' book, he lays out chapter by chapter it's not really an argument. It's a presentation of what's going on in philosophy of mind, in neuroscience, and in cognitive science, and how we address consciousness and how we address the relationship of a living system to its environment, and how and what consciousness is, or what consciousness does. So we're going to unpack that in this conversation. But like I said, I found the book accessible and challenging at times, but nonetheless accessible to someone at my level. If you are a undergrad student, this is an excellent book. If you're getting into the field of cog sci or phil of mind, so I would highly recommend that for you. If you're a postgrad and this is a good book to just digest and get other perspectives, or get a compendium of perspectives together and listen to what read rather what James has to say about his perspectives. And we'll touch on that too, namely the living mirrors theory of consciousness. And I love how you, at one point in the book, you you had another description for the living mirrors, and I'll quote that in a little bit, but I thought that was great.
Yeah.
So that was for the audience. Now to you, James, let's talk about the provenance of this book, or what brought you to this point in your life to write this book.
Yeah. So we spoke a couple of years ago, and that was a couple of years after I'd published my living mirror theory of consciousness in academic journal, and it was making this case that consciousness didn't come into existence with nervous systems or brains. It came into existence with the origins of life. And obviously in us, consciousness the brain is involved in our structural unconscious content, but I think that's because it's part of the living body rather than that it's the the CEO that's making the decisions, and that it kind of generates consciousness or anything like that. So I wrote the paper, and very quickly kind of realized that it wasn't landing with people. People weren't seeing this the way that I was seeing it, in the sense that I'd put in, from my perspective, this was, I guess, what I was doing. I was presenting a final puzzle piece, but other people hadn't arranged the puzzle the way I had. So it's like, okay, well, that's an opinion. That's like a possibility. But I was like, no, like, you don't see how it makes everything fit. And so I was like, okay, I think I need to unpack this. I need to unpack these different aspects of how I'm approaching this. So my part of the reason, my perspective is slightly different, I think, is that, as we spoke about in the last time we spoke, as a teenager, I had this awakening experience that has led to a kind of lifelong different perspective to the normal perspective, and how the world looks to me. And so certain assumptions, what that basically consisted of was seeing that certain things I thought were real aren't actually real. They're mental constructs. And so I go through that in the book, and I think that contemplative practice and interrogating our kind of common sense assumptions about how the world is and what we are, I think that's kind of blocking progress in consciousness science. Because if you assume that you are a self that inhabits the body, and it's the self that becomes conscious, then I think the self is one of these things that I'm saying actually consciousness arises, and then within that the self arises like an avatar. So it's not the self that is conscious. And so these are the kinds of issues that I thought needed a book length treatment. And I'd always wanted to write a book, even before the Living Mirror Theory came out. I'd always wanted to write a book synthesizing science and spirituality, because I came to spirituality precisely because I was really frustrated with this kind of supernaturalism and dogmatism of the Catholicism which I was raised. And so I had this profound kind of spiritual awakening. And then the thing that I've always wanted to kind of communicate to as many people as possible really is like, this isn't nonsense. This isn't a delusion. This isn't like the good stuff that we all seek in life is available, and there is no barrier to entry in terms of believing made up stuff. And there's a lot of that in the way spirituality is spoken about. So I'd always had this kind of science and spirituality book in me, and so it all kind of came together, and I was like, this all fits as one coherent thing, where in unpacking the spiritual perspective, if you want to call it that, it kind of sets you up nicely to then talk about the science. So I split the book into those two parts: the kind of philosophy stuff in the first part, kind of naturalist and spirituality, and then going into the more hard science in the second half.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I found so much convergence in your presentation with how I've been lensing things lately, or my perspectival knowing that I'm trying to cultivate. And it starts with, as you said in the beginning, in the philosophy aspect of bringing things into focus for people, is the idea of a union of opposites, or a tonos developed between, I don't know if this is a word, unitarity or a unitary status of whatever a universal system is, whatever existence is, and the apparent cellularity of that system, and how a functioning agential system like this, or it sees that cellularity and interprets a cellularity in that. So I love that you work with that there is, and I'll let you do a better job in explaining it, like the ungrounded awareness, or the unitarity, the entirety, and the interconnectedness of whatever it is that is. And again, how there can be healthy, efficient ways of understanding that, but there can also be these ways of sort of confabulating an otherness to it. So I'll hand it back to you, and we'll start with that. So, I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah, like recently I've been, the book, I try to really, as you said, present it in a very linear way where you can follow step by step, and I'm not assuming any prior knowledge, and I want to bring people along. And if you're entirely new to thinking about experience consciousness, I think you can begin and see step by step the perspective I'm coming to. But since I've done that, I've been really sitting more and more with how to articulate and communicate just this vision of like the final kind of endpoint of like, what is this perspective that I'm putting forward? And so in the book, I don't spend that much time there's a bit at the end where I describe it, but I've been sitting with that. And so that's what you just described, brings that up for me. So I'll try and give a flavor of that. because you could say one of the core, so I mentioned the idea that the self is a mental construct. And when I say the self, I mean this kind of idea of being a stable, like James, that inhabits the body in some way. But I do think then you can say, okay, well, what about the body, right? Well, there are, as we're talking now, there are two human bodies that have different spheres of awareness. And so if you want to say that's a self, you could use the word self in that way. That would be kind of reasonable. But you need to be clear what you're talking about. In Buddhism, when they talk about no self, they're not talking about there isn't a body. But you can understand, well, if you say, well, actually, what is a body? A body is like an open, to be a living thing is an open process. We're kind of like a cresting wave out of, because reality is fundamentally interconnected. You can actually say, well, actually, is there a thing that's a body that's separate to the rest of the world? And I think the answer is actually no. So imagine before minds, before life, there's just the totality, the unitary nature of existence, as you mentioned. And then things start to kind of clump, or you get some inhomogeneity where you get what you call kind of quasi things. You get little, for example, like if you have a dead body, to us that looks like a thing, looks like an object. We categorize that as an object, but actually over time it will degrade and it will just mix with everything else and compost into the earth. So like at what point is there no longer a thing there? Like this can give people a feel that objects are things we perceive rather than things that actually have their own objective existence. But so the reason I'm getting into this is that when we start to think about what it means to be a conscious thing, we get into this idea of what is it to be a thing, and actually objectively there aren't things, but we're the kind of quasi thing that can like pretend it's a thing. So in our experience, we start to, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy where we have this idea of self where I'm kind of constantly perceiving, okay, well, these bits are James, and then that's the outside world. And I think with life, like we start to chunk up the world perceptually into different objects, and then we don't forget it so much, but our naive realist way of perceiving the world is that, well, okay, I just live in a universe full of objects and they're genuinely separate, and that's just how things are. And so deconstructing that, discovering that actually the world isn't inherently made of separate things, it's an interdependent whole, I think is a good corrective. And then you can start to be more precise. When I say, okay, we're like a quasi thing that can perceive itself to be a thing, I think it's a lot more accurate than just saying, oh, I'm a thing. Like to be a living thing is truly an objectively separate thing from the rest of the world. And this is, I guess you could say the core of spirituality is working on that feeling of separation and moving towards unity, wholeness, all these principles that are bigger than our small sense of self that keeps us feeling separate and kind of alienated from the rest of existence. But yeah, so then I think when you do that, the science starts to make more sense, and you start to have a lot more clarity about what consciousness is. And so I describe it in this picture as a kind of relationality, a way of the organism engaging with its environment, where there isn't. It's almost as if the organism and environment are two sides of the same coin. There's not a truly separate thing that just is conscious. It's alienated. It's like a kind of, I didn't put this in the book, but I've said since that it's like we're like the eyes with which the universe sees, because of the interdependent structure of the universe that's kind of interwoven. It crests. We're like a cresting wave. I'm really going to mix my metaphors here. It's a cresting wave that kind of becomes aware and like takes in the universe. So it's common for people in kind of spiritual circles, I think, to come up with quite a kind of static image of only consciousness existing, and we can go into like I think why people do that. Whereas I think that I guess the view that I'm expressing is a lot more dynamic and strange loopy, and that there are aspects of reality that are outside of consciousness, but we'll never know them directly, but they are us. And so there's this kind of ongoing exploration always, basically, which is hard to put into words because I'm kind of pointing towards the flavor of spiritual awakening, which is this kind of letting go of the need to box in reality into objects and just becoming the expressiveness of existence. But then you never step back and verify that that's what's happening, because that would be to box it in. So it's this like, you can't say anything about it really. Anyway, so that's trying to give a flavor of vibing off of what you said there about the kind of the multiplicity, but also the unitiveness, and where we fit into this whole picture of the evolving universe.
I laugh because I haven't been meditating for took a break because I did it for about 10 years straight, really intense, like I do with my whole life. And one thing I noticed is when I was able to get into those really, whatever they are, minimal states, that if I thought about the minimal state, poop, it's like
Right,
you ruin
right.
it. So what you just said was basically that in a nutshell. It's like
That mental fixation is the obscuration of it. Like that thinking is literally the only thing that stops it being really obvious at all times. Because like that is always what is happening is the billowing forth of the unity of reality. And
Mhm.
yet we get this thing like, nope, I'm James, and like I'm really James. Like sure, like, on a conventional level, I'm James, but
Yeah,
am I
yeah,
really ultimately like, or is it more accurate to say I'm the energy of the universe, or like whatever lens you want to put on it? Like
hmm
it's really seeing like, oh, of course I'm not like me being James isn't like the deepest, most fundamental thing that's going on in this moment. Like, and it's kind of
right.
funny when that's kind of what awakening is really, is to look at that and go, oh wow, I really thought like the truest, deepest thing I could say is like, I'm a person walking to the shops, and like that's what's happening now, as opposed to seeing that again, there's the unitive expressiveness of existence. There's
hmm
an organism that's birthed, and in every moment it's running this little simulation story of like to keep everything stable and seemingly normal.
hmm
Which is why I think talking about spirituality stuff can freak people out, because they're like, wait, I do think that's what's happening. You're telling me something else is happening. But
Right.
yeah, you can taste, you can drop into that wholeness that and it is associated with deep well-being, and just a suspension of all the concerns that play out in that simulation of really thinking that you are that person navigating this little life.
hmm hmm Yeah, I almost think of it as a kind of positive valenced disassociation, but not to
That's
put any
nice.
baggage on that word
Yeah.
disassociation. And some people do have psychotic ish or psychosis, I think, because of you talked to Willoughby from the Cheetah House. I think you
Britta.
had her
Yeah,
as a
yeah.
guest. Yeah, perfect example. There are people who can have that happen, but when things are working right or not working right,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that you get into that space. And I think it is so refreshing to, I like to say it's not being you for a while. It's
Right.
taking off. But again, you have to be very careful in that space to not go, like, wow, that was great. You go back into affective
Yeah,
response.
there's a lot of, I mean, you're intentionally opening and destabilizing the identity structures. So there is a lot of volatility that can arise, which is why it's important, yeah, to like, I guess, have maps and know what you're doing to some extent, or at least have
hmm
care and support and know how to care for yourself. Um, but yeah, like once it stabilizes, yeah, it doesn't dissociation. I totally know what you mean when you say positive events dissociation, but then once it stabilizes, that the phrase dissociation doesn't feel as accurate, because it feels like this is, if you want to say the energy of existence or whatever, like
hmm
that's your true nature. That's a phrase that's used a lot in spirituality, and it's like, I'm actually that the dissociation was the fantasy of being the separate self that was
mm
truly alienated and separate from the rest of the world, that was big and scary. And when you are just that effortless flow, it's yeah, it's so you're so, I mean, you are everything, you are the intimacy of everything. So there is no it's kind of the opposite of dissociation, because there's nothing to
Yeah.
dissociate from. It's just the one. Yeah,
Yeah, like a comforting reassociation, but in a counterintuitive sense, it at first
but
seems
not,
like a
yeah, not back into your
dissociation.
right.
Yeah, yeah, but it is a
Yeah, it's like you're dissociating from a
reassociation.
false self. Yeah, constructed self. Yeah,
Once again, union of opposites kind of thing. Like
right, right.
things are happening, and but yeah, what I'd like to do is, and I'll say this for the audience because you and I talked about it. So I have a list of
Mm-hmm.
quotes from the book, and I want to start actually in a nonlinear fashion because there's a summative statement at the end of the book, and so I'm going to be a bad show host and just pull up the tab real quick so I can read the quote because I want to get it right, and I don't have that good of a memory. So
I
I'll
appreciate
read a
that.
summative statement from the towards I think it was like the second to last paragraph of the book that I present to you, and then we'll talk about it. So let me find it.
There's not like a twist to the ending. So you're not going to
Yeah,
ruin
no,
it.
I'm not gonna ruin anything. Oh gosh. I thought I had it as one of the last statements. Okay. Actually, you know what? I want to read what I was kind of laughing about a moment ago when we talk about the living mirrors, because this will help us
Mm.
unpack
I was
um,
going to say, if you're going to remember that one without reading it off the screen, I'd be impressed.
that. Yeah, well, I could probably, coarse grain it, and I'm just being a terrible producer and not seeing it stand out in the 15 comments that I've let's see, Okay. I know what the last sentence is, so that'll stand out to me more than
Your
anything.
cat's wandering in the background, so that's entertaining for people
Oh,
while you're
good.
doing
Yeah. Yeah.
that.
She's close to her dinner time. So yeah, she can keep you guys entertained. Uh oh, for goodness sakes. I'm so sorry, James. This is bad
It's all
producing.
right.
Uh
I know the stress of being a podcast host, so I
ah,
sympathize.
okay. Why am I not? Why is it? Oh, wait, there's more up here. Duh. I didn't scroll up enough. That's why. Okay, sorry. Here we go. Okay. Okay, here it is. I unpack in part in that context, this could in that context, this perspective could be called biopsychic Darwin transcendental dialectical process relational neutral monism, but I think living mirrors theory is more catchy. So I sorry for botching the setup on that, but I love this because it's telling a story. Biopsychic Darwin transcendental dialectical process relational
Yeah.
neutral monism. So let's
It should be Darwinian. Did my maybe my
uh,
copy editor change it in the last movie spell?
no,
Does
no,
it
it
say
is.
Darwin in the?
Yeah, well, it's Darwinian transcendental
Okay,
dialectical
good,
process
great. All right,
relational neutral monism. Sorry to the audience. I know that was
that's all
painful,
right.
but I'll smooth out as I go along.
Yeah,
I thought I had it lower in the thing. Anyway, so let's talk about living mirrors and all of that all the big stuff that we just mentioned, because I think
yeah,
that'll lend itself to our being able to anchor in some ideas in
yeah,
the
yeah,
book.
yeah. So it's a funny story behind that. I on the day that I finished the book, I I've been on my own kind of personal journey with like spirituality and doing a lot of kind of somatic work and becoming very kind of grounded and centered in the present moment. And on the day I was ready to submit the book to my editor, I was going for a walk with my son, and I was just like looking out at this nice landscape, and I was like, wow, it's done. Like I've put down the book in writing, and it really felt like, as I said, I'd always wanted to articulate this science and spirituality vision, and with spirituality, a big part of it is letting go of the rational mind that wants to come up with stories and navigate and just settling into the present moment. So I did that. I was like, you know what, like I could let my rational mind like keep habitually just going, but I was like, in this moment, you're done. Like take this. You've crossed the finishing line. Just surrender. Just be here now. And so I took a really deep breath, exhaled, and
Mhm.
I lost consciousness for the first time in my life.
Oh my gosh.
I just collapsed around. I got a concussion, had to get an ambulance and go to
Oh,
the
for
hospital.
goodness sakes.
And it was, but it's a very, ironically, the last paragraph it added to the book was a description of how I think that basically that it could be physically possible for mental states to cause physical states, for the brain,
Uh-huh.
for kind of conscious states to change the body, and that's what I experienced then. The intention to relax. I think my blood pressure plummeted in a way that it's hasn't happened before,
Okay.
and so I was in when I was doing that. My wife kept asking me throughout the day because I lost my memory for a while. I had amnesia for a while. She kept asking me to repeat that phrase that you just said. What was it? Process relational, Darwinian, transcendental, biopsychic, neutral monism, whatever it was.
Yeah,
Because I
yeah.
can't even remember it now. Because the point, I mean, and I could do it, which was good, which reassured her. But yeah, so I put that phrase in because I was like, it's not meant to be. I can say I can't even fully remember off the top of my head because it's not meant to be used. In a kind of conversational setting, but it was to really flesh out, like if I'm being precise about like what is this picture that I'm presenting here, and you could say with my original Living Mirrors paper, what I said was like, oh, I'm proposing a kind of like biopsychism within a kind of predictive processing framework, which is how a lot of people think about consciousness in the brain. So like all living things are conscious through those principles. And then people were like, okay, like fine, that's one version. And so I mentioned at the start, my impetus to write the book was that okay, I actually have to flesh out the Darwinian transcendental, like all of all of the other bits.
Hmm.
Yeah, and so I do that in that paragraph, and I go through the whole book. So I won't unpack it all here. But yeah, there's a it's a I mentioned you kind of start with the philosophy before I get into the science, and so the neutral monism is like that reality itself doesn't have we don't have to think it's either matter or mind, and it's very common, as I said, to people to kind of collapse from a kind of naive materialism of thinking the world is made of solid substance, and then they interrogate that and they realize actually the feeling of substance, of not being able to pass through an object, is a kind of representation of a relational property. It's like I can't, like I'm mainly empty space. This chair's mainly empty space, as people may have heard, and so like why aren't I passing through it? it's not because we are actually really like these solid material substantial things. It's more just like to do with the physics that passing through doesn't happen. Then my brain is like, okay, that feels like solidity. So then if you don't generalize that to reality itself, you can get into thinking of reality as basically insubstantial, not being made of a solid substance. So I'm still a physicalist in that I think that what the patterns in reality that physicists study are fundamental in some sense. But I'm not a materialist in the sense that I don't think, and that would include consciousness, because a lot of people want to say consciousness is like a substrate that reality is made of. So I advocate for what's process relational neutral monism. So it's the idea that reality is a kind of a flowing, a process. It's not made of solid substances. It's a process. And just because our minds may not like that, because our minds like to box things in terms of solid substance, I don't think that's a reason we should reject that way of looking. And I think it's, it's powerful. So yeah, I realize now that I could keep going with unpacking that definition for the rest of the episode. So I'll let you jump in and decide where to take the conversation.
Well, I thought I'd throw that out as our first quote because, and prior to that, you had explained that living mirrors was your thesis, and but this kind of unpacks it a little bit in a terminal. Semantic sense,
right?
So the people that focus on this kind of work can catch that. But what I'll do is I'll keep myself out of trouble and I'll read some quotes out that are in a linear fashion from the book. I'll save the summative statement actually for the end because I think it would satisfy. All right, so let me get back up to the top of my scroll. Okay, so the first quote is, we can reserve the term awareness for this aspect of consciousness. In the mystical state, awareness is seen to be formless in that the forms that arise in consciousness and make up the conscious content all appear in the same formless awareness. And we've touched on this a little bit so far, but is there anything else? And you can skip these quotes and say, well, we kind of covered that. So whatever you want to do with it, you can say go or pass or.
No, that's I'm sure it'll be go on all of them. So that's I think an important differentiation to make, and people can use different words for these things. But yeah, to me, I think it's important to talk about the space in which experiences arise, and I use reserve the word awareness for that. It's important to differentiate that from the contents. They're not like truly differentiated in the sense that, again, like the waves in the ocean aren't truly separate from the ocean. You can't really pull them out. The contents really arise within that awareness, but it really, if you don't at first conceptually dissociate them, you can get confused. And so I think we need to be thinking about how does this space in which experiences arise come into existence? And this space is here right now for all of us. It's a kind of pristine, open, uncorruptible space of awareness in that, in spirituality and like Buddhism in particular, there's a lot of time people use the analogy of a mirror, that like no matter what arises in the mirror, it never corrupts the mirror. You could have the most grotesque image, you could hold a mirror up to a war zone, but the mirror is still pristine. It's perfectly, what it is, which is partly why I mentioned the level of well-being. It's been some of the scientific literature has been called fundamental well-being, the kind of the quality of just, it's a well-being when you notice this and you can drop into it. It's a well-being that's like, it's fundamental because it's like you opt out of the entire paradigm in which you would not have well-being. The entire paradigm, as I mentioned before, of really thinking the contents are literally like the most real thing that's happening, that I'm James and I'm going about my life. Like there's nothing deeper than that. Instead, if you can drop beyond that into, okay, well, that's actually arising for me now in this awareness, that awareness, is completely unperturbed. So it's also, there is a certain kind of binary quality to it as well, in that when it's there, so it's like having a perspective on reality. You can't have a little bit of a perspective. As soon as you've gone from having no perspective to having to having even the smallest perspective, there's a full-blown perspective there. So I think there is this kind of binary, a lot of scientists want to talk about the idea of consciousness gradually emerging through evolution. I think partly to it's a critique I present in the book. I think that's partly motivated by a kind of unconscious bias towards human exceptionalism, of wanting to preserve our place in nature as those who get to dominate nature, that emerged a few hundred years ago, along with kind of colonialism and capitalism. So there's a whole kind of section in the book on that. And I think that's blocking us to seeing our kinship with the rest of the living world and how consciousness comes into existence with life. Yeah, I can leave that there.
Okay, all right. And let's see, I'll get the next quote here.
But yeah,
Due
I should
to,
maybe just say that I think that
yeah.
to really make it clear what I'm saying, I'm saying it's not a gradual picture, that actually there is this binary shift with the origin of life. So
Mm-hmm.
that brings in this awareness. You can
Mm-hmm.
talk about the contents becoming richer in us. I'm sure, deep dreamless sleep versus right now, there's a lot more content happening. And so you
Mm-hmm.
can imagine maybe an amoeba has quite minimal content, perhaps, if it's comfortable in its little niche. But even if it turns out that plants and single celled organisms have very minimal contents, and say basically almost nothing there at all, I think we need to be thinking of them as like us in a deep dreamless sleep, with the latent capacity as our kind of distant relatives, which they literally are,
Mm-hmm.
with the latent capacity to have experiences like us, rather than thinking of them as inert little robots that function by reflex. I think that basically functioned as propaganda for the new system when Descartes kind of came up with the idea a few hundred years ago, in terms of the subjects of nature, which were always just seemed kind of obvious to animistic traditions, were actually, the story was actually their objects, and so you don't have to feel empathy for them. You can do whatever you want with them, and I think that's what has got. That's kind of the core philosophical shift that's got us into the mess we're in now socially, with climate crisis and ecological breakdown, and just the othering of the rest of the natural world and the elevation of the human to kind of superior status.
Mm-hmm. Taking us out of the continuum. I like to
Right.
look. It's just like that tonos that we arrive from cellularity and an undifferentiated state. I like to think of us that exceptionalism extracts us out of a continuity or a continuum
Definitely.
and Mike Levin's work speaks to this, and he's addressing
Right.
this, and
Right.
that there is at that prime, that single cell level, the animalcule is executing functions. And we'll get into Markov blankets and things like that. But yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And we need to sort of
Yeah.
reorder ourselves in that continuum
Yeah. And
to
I
have
mean,
a better
I think
ethical lens, I think. Yeah.
when you see things this way, yeah, you can really see a kind of scale-free fractal vision of
Hmm.
discord and suffering, in which basically all suffering is a form of separation or a lack of wholeness, where on the individual level, feeling like you genuinely are a separate small self, that's kind of the engine of suffering, as Buddhism attests to. And then at the level of interhuman oppression, there's always this kind of othering and demonizing of the other who you want to harm. And then at the level of the environment, where yeah, we think that we are separate, we don't see that we are we are nature. And so yeah, you can see that if people are moved by the suffering of the world and want to relieve it, I think understanding this full stack of the fractal nature of kind of separation, and the solution being wholeness, is really important, because otherwise you have kind of revolutions where people think that, oh well, I'm the good guy, and so I'll just do whatever I want to those bad guys, and then you get atrocities, and if we want to move the world towards a better place, we need to be taking that individual responsibility to seeing how are we showing up in the world that adds to that fire of separation that does naturally spread if we're not actually doing the inner work to put it out.
Hmm. Hmm. And we've been charged with the terrible burden of having this sort of metacognitive, self-reflective capacity that
Right.
that affords us this, is very dichotomous, I mean, I hate to say that, but it's just like there's so much potential either way, that
Oh
that
yeah.
that
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
it's our way out, but it's also what has kept us in this horrific state for what, no, 200 years or thereabouts.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know. There was a timeline, but yeah, I agree. I agree, and it's to me. Well, no, no, no opinions. Let me read the. Yeah, they want to
I
hear
enjoy
you.
your opinions. So.
Okay, well, I'll move on to the next statement because I want the audience to get as much out of this. Uh, Due to the intermediate nature of quantum systems and the non-existence of their states before they occur in the form of relations, we participate in the continual co-authoring of reality through our interactions with the wider world. So, I don't know if that ties into where we've
Yeah,
been
yeah,
or.
that'll be fun to talk about. But it's a quote from the end of a quite dense chapter on yeah, and like, under the
Yeah.
relational interpretation of quantum mechanics. So I'll give it a go. But if people, yeah, it's people will definitely get more out of it reading the book, I think, if it's
Yeah,
stuff like this.
yeah.
But it's
And these are
so yeah,
teasers. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, so that's particularly influenced by Carlo Rovelli's book Helgoland, where he articulates this relational view of quantum mechanics, which is basically, so I mentioned before, a process relational view of reality. And I mentioned what process was, so I didn't talk about relationality. But it's what I was talking about early on with interdependence, that we're not truly separate things because everything is woven together. The fabric of reality is this interwoven tapestry. And yeah, physics is coming around to that in terms of that being, Carlo Rovelli is a highly respected mainstream physicist, and he's saying what people like Fritjof Capra, I mean, who's also a serious physicist, scientist, but he was, I think, not taken as seriously by the scientific mainstream for talking about the parallels with kind of Eastern mysticism and physics. But yeah, so this view that interdependence and its flip side, emptiness, insubstantiality, where there are no separate things, but there's only this empty web of occurrences, that's a way to understand what happens in subatomic physics that makes sense of the mysteries. That so it's to do with kind of you can also cache it in terms of information where it's like that's actually a whole lot of camel worms, but but yeah, it's as if we are fully embedded in reality, and when we interact with anything, it's not that there's a locally real world of objects that we can observe as truly separate observers. Rather, we are co-authoring reality, as I said in that quote, where the interaction is the what would you say? The physical property of if you measure the spin of a particle, it's not that it has a spin and you are a separate thing and you get to look at that spin. The interaction that gives the observation of that spin is what exists. Like that is the physical occurrence. So it's like the occurrences, the interactions are what exist, and there isn't actually an independently existing thing behind it. So yeah, it's a picture that again weaves us fully into participatory systems in the world. And it's kind of, I think once this clicks for people, it can seem kind of crazy that people didn't see it this way in terms of like when physicists were studying doing the kind of early experiments on quantum mechanics, clearly you are like they would obviously have to agree that they're a physical system and that they're interacting with the physical systems they're studying. So it seems funny that you wouldn't factor that in, that you would be so taken in by the illusion I described before of like, no, I'm really separate. I'm over here. Like I'm James in the body in my head. That's a physical thing out there in the world. That's not, so this is why the spirituality thing is necessary, because like that's actually not what's going on the most fundamental level. What's going on is this unitive flux of being. And that's necessary, I think, for scientists to get straight on what's going on in reality. But on an individual level, it's good to know that you can discover that for yourself, like through your own experience, and that it's associated with the relief of suffering.
Yeah, it makes it difficult to have a third person perspective in those measurements. And Mike Levin said, second person, maybe consider that as being relational and being co-authoring or co-participating.
That's another thing is that you can't. Yeah, that's a great thing to raise, because I mentioned before that with the kind of experiential state of awakening, there's no ability to step back and verify what's happening. There's just the perfect intimacy with what's happening. And yeah, that stepping back and wanting to verify is what it feels like to be a self that doesn't feel at home in the world. And so physics had this, and most science has this illusion that we can do that we can actually have a God's eye view of the objective world. Like the world is a solid, stable object, and we can just look at it and describe it, and that's it. Like that's the end of the day, like what's happening. But actually, we're so completely embedded in it. This is why I describe it as kind of strange, loopy thing, where it's like there's this awareness, and then you come up with models of a world that's kind of out of reach behind the awareness, but then those models are arising within awareness, but maybe they can actually explain what we are and explain that awareness, but they never encompass the awareness. So it gets very, you mentioned groundless before. Like I think being comfortable with that state of, it's a very kind of mind expanding state of just like, whoa, like I am just this weird interplay of beingness trying to know itself, never fully, it's like the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. If you identify with the head of the snake and think that to understand reality, you need to consume the whole of the body, you're never going to do that, because you are the whole body and it's continuous with the head. Whereas if you just stop identifying with the head, it's like, oh, I am the whole snake, and it doesn't matter that can't be known from one perspective. The whole thing is in a state of absolute perfect harmony. So that's kind of what reality is like, I think, and what I was describing earlier with like, well, with idealism, it can be very static. Like, nope, there's just like the lights are on and that's the ground of being. That's like, whereas what I'm saying is this very, yeah, again, words fail when you try to describe it, but I think that imagery hopefully gives a flavor of it.
Right. Right. No, I no, and you did a fair treatment of that, which takes us back to kind of neutral monism, right? To say that there is, we don't get confused into a purely idealist framework or a purely materialist framework. That I call it phasal monism myself. That's my little way of getting my head to stop hurting. And that's a lot like neutral monism. That it's what phase is occurring, or what phase
Yeah,
am I
right, right.
lensing things myself.
Yeah, and I think the neutrality of it is, I guess I could call it like non-conceptual monism to throw another one into the mix, which is to say
Mm-hmm.
that to recognize that the pulling back and trying to conceptualize reality isn't reality. So if I say, oh, reality is made of a substance, it's made of matter, it's made of consciousness, those are always ideas arising within the space of awareness. And they never, like, reality is just, it's just entirely outside of our mental paradigms. And it's under no obligation to be encompassed by our thoughts about it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which when you say reality is like beyond, it could sound really like trippy, but actually it's like super simple. It's just like, why would you think that your thoughts can encompass reality? It's like, it's non-conceptual in that it's utterly itself in like a way that transcends our ideas about it. I don't know if this is making sense to people, but hopefully they're catching the vibe.
Yeah, well, and we can grant ourselves an epistemic humility brought on by the fact that we are an evolved creature, but nonetheless, this obvious, primate that, is doing what it can with its cognitive resources or its
Right,
perceptual
right.
resources. So I that's
That level of
I
humility is good as well. Yeah,
yeah, epistemic humility, which goes
yeah,
into, epoche or any of these other wonderful philosophical terms, and that help us relieve ourselves of the anguish of trying to solve all the
right.
riddles. So anyway, I have a feel good quote here. I think for me it's a feel good quote. Let's see. When we see reality itself as being more fundamental than our ideas about it, we can feel it to have a freshness and aliveness that
Mm.
cannot be put into. This speaks to what we were just been talking about, cannot be
Yeah,
put
yeah,
into words, and we can be left with a sense that existence itself is deeply mysterious. What a good timing for that quote. But I think that
yeah.
fits with
That's
kind of what we've been
exactly.
trying to.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Maybe that one is the past because that is what we were talking. No, that is
Yeah.
exactly what we were just talking about. Yeah, but no, but I will say that yeah, that aliveness and freshness takes it more into the personal, what it can feel like in one's own experience. It's like the the death of fixed concepts in experience is actually the birth of true aliveness, true freshness. Like when you let everything wash through in the kind of eternal wind of impermanence, to just be like, okay, I'm going to die, and these ideas are going, and every sensation is passing away as soon as it's arising. That can bring up a lot of fear and grief and all this stuff that you process on this path. But then once you come to terms with that, you're left just with absolute freshness, aliveness, vitality to the contents of experience. That's truly wonderful and kind of what we all want, I think. Uh, so yeah, this isn't just some ideas about the nature of reality. This comes really, again, this kind of scale free fractal view where like these dynamics are playing out in you in every moment, and it's possible to align with them, um, and it brings great well being.
Absolutely. All right. Let me see what I can fish out of my quote box here. Let's see.
But yeah, the the thing I'll say on that is that with the death of fixed ideas thing, the bad
Uh,
news for the individual is that they are one of those ideas. The separate self is an idea arising in awareness. So that's
right.
where the fear and stuff can arise because the feeling that this is about James has to kind of get out of the way for just the unitive expressiveness to enjoy itself, really.
hmm Well, let's run with that for a second. In the idea of the selfness, and maybe we use the E word, the ego, the character that we are, or the persona that we are. If we were to create an idealized mm, sort of cultural paradigm that would relieve a lot of suffering and negative
Mm.
affect, I I think we've done a lot of wonderful things in the West with technology and with information and intelligence, but yeah, it seems that there is absent that recognition. This goes back to a lot of things we just touched on
Yeah, yeah,
with the
yeah.
sensitivity to connectedness, but also, um, this might be a tangent that could take us forever into some other domain, but just the idea of, there's Eastern thought that addresses this more, but I mean, what do we do in the West in 2024, to not a quick fix, not a instant gratification
Right.
kind of
Right.
thing, but just a heuristic or a tool or a mechanism, psychotechnological mechanism that you could suggest to people that
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
be a starting point. Let's put it that way for this uh, pressure release of where we are egoically and psychosocially and
Yeah. Yeah.
psychoemotionally,
Yeah.
all these things.
Yeah. So the framework that I would think about this from is the thing I described before about how at all levels separation is the thing. Perceived separation is the psychological framework that leads to discord and suffering and lack of harmony and lack of wholeness and peace and those things. And so I think anything we can do to move in that direction is it. So for me, it's about orienting in that direction rather than, you mentioned like not a quick fix, right? We don't want to be like, okay, and even having any idea of some fixed endpoint, of like, well, then there'll be utopia or whatever, or
Hmm.
then I'll be, that is, you're then in the mind paradigm of, again, of being like, well, I'm James on my journey, and you're escaping the wholeness of the present moment to imagine that you're going to have it in the future.
Hmm.
So you really need to, well, you don't need to do anything about it, but my takeaway is that orienting in the present moment is the solution, is
Hmm.
orienting to wholeness, to authenticity, to the layers of, because the separate self, the psychology of separation is there to really manage, to try and manage everything, but a lot of it's trying to manage kind of trauma and just whatever you don't want to face, basically, whether it's parts of reality you don't want to face, but also parts of yourself. So it's this whole kind of struggle. And so just noticing that, and the solution to that, because it's going to be an authentic way of being, is to deepen into authenticity, connection, wholeness. And that can be done on an individual level. I created a bunch of free materials on my innerspaceinstitute.org
Hmm.
website that people can, if they're interested in the personal journey of this stuff. And then, yeah, I also I spent, many years really preoccupied with like socially, like how do you scale this basically? Like how do you, in a bottom up way, spread greater well being or greater harmony and reduce suffering this way? And I guess as on my own journey of reducing my own egoic kind of dynamics, I came to see that it was really the egoic side of me that was preoccupied with that, in the sense that I guess I had some belief that like I could try and fix it or change it, or like not, like it wasn't acceptable the way it is now. And we all have this, we all want to try and figure out what's going on and where we should align ourselves and what we should rally behind. So I did end up, I guess, fleshing out a picture that I found relatively satisfying. But it now, if I speak about it, it comes from a very grounded place where I don't think it's actually, going to. Basically, it's like who was Aldous Huxley, I think it was, had a quote which was like, it's very embarrassing that after having been concerned with like the suffering of mankind from it, my life, the best advice I can give people is to be a little kinder to each other. And it's something like that, which is like you want to solve the whole thing, and then you're like, actually, to address this stuff at its root is just to orient towards, if you want a world with more love and connection and healing and positivity and stuff, you just have to do that, because we are the fabric of reality. We are especially the fabric of society. You just need to start doing it basically in your own life and
Hmm.
letting it radiate out. And then all the other stuff will happen anyway, whether people have, political movements and like, revolutions will still happen and all those kinds of dynamics that play out. But at least you'll be laying a foundation in the social fabric of harmony, so that you don't get the kind of toxic egoic dynamics playing out that I described before.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Which leads me to a question, and this could be really off the wall, but when we talk about being in a state of psychic duress, or not duress, but malaise, the term self-awareness comes up a lot. And if we're titrating out of a psycho-emotional injury that may lead us into narcissism or sociopathy or other mechanisms of defense and insulating. The term self-awareness itself could seem to um, have an interesting path that leads into the no self, So it seems like it's an
Right. Right.
intermediary phase. Like you understand that maybe your selvingness or your selving process, if you can, captures, that narcissism or whatever as a means of coping, relating, medicating, whatever. But getting back into being a self-aware person, and then to take that next step in
Right.
no self-awareness. So
Yeah, yeah,
if
yeah.
that made sense,
No, that totally made
like a
sense. So, yeah, it's
reversing out of that over amplification of self-interest, self independence, or
right,
all
right,
this
right.
other stuff.
Yeah, it's almost as if I guess you could say that there's I like the way you put it, that there's like this division of like self and world, and then it's like to dismantle it or to see through it, you need to turn attention onto it and kind
Mm.
of to really see the connection and harmony that's there behind it instead of it's kind of to be in that so to be present when you're fully present there isn't a sense of self, and then to to be in the like being in a kind of egoic mindset is to be in motion in just managing one's as an internal world but also the external world, and always kind of weaving through your mind reality of like going, what am I doing? So I think that's why like when you do that and you do become self-aware, you're stopping and you're interrogating and you're leading to a kind of homeostatic rebalancing and an opening.
Okay.
And that doesn't happen when you're the opposite of this would be a kind of addictive craving seeking mindset. And I think there's like there's those studies where it's like people were given the opportunity to be alone with themselves in a room for like 10 minutes or to take an electric shock, and like a lot of people took the electric shock. um, and um,
Oh
and
my
there's also a quote that's like all of humanity's problems stem from the inability of people to be alone with themselves, quiet, to sit quietly in a room alone with themselves. And that goes back to what I was talking about before, this internal kind of psychological division and internal struggle. And I think that's totally right, that if we had a paradigm that encouraged that, that would be, yeah, I mean, I'm not reinventing the wheel here. I'm basically talking about meditation and those kinds of paradigms. But I think with something I've learned, I've worked with individuals on this stuff over a few years now, and something I've learned is that, so you take the extreme example of someone like a narcissist or someone who's really identified as separate and that they need to be managing their own needs and they're showing up in a way that's causing harm. What I've seen on the spectrum of more mild, just usual egoic stuff is that I guess I used to think like, why I wish those people would take on the responsibility of doing the inner work and doing that kind of healing work. But what I think I've come to realize is that people behave that way typically because they don't have the resources or the networks of care or the support to let go into the other route, which would be to face their trauma and do all that work. And that was quite I guess liberating in the sense when I saw that, because I've always felt like when you see through the illusion of self, you realize that the person you think is the worst person in the world, they are you with different conditioning. There is no extra molecule of James that makes me James. And so if I think if you made me them with all their genetics, all their conditioning, if I think, well, I wouldn't behave that way, like that's delusion. That's magical thinking. There's nothing, I would literally be them. I am them. So that gives you a sense of like, oh, they're like a psychotic person who's someone who's like backed into a corner and like completely driven to a state of like fight or flight defense. And if only they had the social fabric and the wisdom to allow them to kind of trust that people genuinely, it's okay for them to face the demons and surrender. Like that building of that capacity is really a prerequisite. We can't just say it's on you as an individual to do your own healing work. I mean, that would be great. And, I think that's a wise way to go for one's own inner world and also the world in general. But if we're not also building that capacity, we shouldn't be surprised if people, there's like a logic to it. There's a reason people aren't surrendering into that.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
I
I'm
don't know if
still
that had
real.
anything to do with our question.
Well, no. I mean, I want this to be a fluid conversation, so
Yeah.
I appreciate that. And I'm still reeling over the fact that people would rather get shocked than to be alone.
It was. I
And
don't want to make up a number, but it was a good chunk. I wouldn't be surprised if it was maybe a third or a half or something. It wasn't like a few percent.
wow, and that could be a series of responses, I guess, like maybe a pathologizing of the social embeddedness, but also, and I mean that like given our like younger folks, and I'm indicting my generation too, that are really into the social media connection and the profilicity of ourselves on social media, and that withdrawal, even for
Mhm.
10 minutes, could be painful, or just not wanting to be with oneself because one's self has to be authentic for 10, or at least
Yeah.
not
I'm not
in a character
I'm
role
not
or
sure
something.
when I'm not sure when the study came out. It might be old. So my instinct is that it might have been before social media age. But
Okay,
yeah, so I
okay.
think it's that I could be wrong, but my instinct is, yeah, it's the psychological stress, and it could actually be a rational decision in the sense that the psychological stress and emotional toll of
Mm,
just having to sit with oneself without a distraction
hmm.
is like, because I think the power of being in the present moment is that it shifts you profoundly out of the egoic mode where you're constantly in motion to, I think homeostasis, this idea of the natural healing capacity the body has, in which, if you've got a cut and it's got some dirt in it, the body will excrete the dirt before healing it. In the same way, like by analogy, when we're storing like emotional pain in our body, like tension and things we don't want to face, and we stop, if you just have to stop and like not think for a while, then those things are going to start to bubble up in the same way they want to get resolved. And so you can come into
Mm,
some homeostatic rebalancing. So I think it's that bubbling up. And then again, without the care, without the support, and without the skills to know how to navigate that, that is a torture. So
mm.
I think there could be a rational reason why, okay, just shock my hand and that's contained and I can just,
Yeah,
um,
it's the
but yeah,
better
it gives you
option.
sympathy for the struggle that people are living with.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, on that note, I would like to move us into, as you said, you move more into a technical and science aspectual treatment of your work here. And so, what I'll do is I'll read a quote that I thought was, for me, it was a great, it's kind of revelatory quote in terms of what philosophy of mind grapples with in that consciousness, qualitative um, experience or phenomenology arising from physicality and from processes. So let me read that quote and we can dive into, uh, um,
Go for it.
yeah, let's see. I had it queued up, but then we started talking. Let's see. Okay. All right. Even a physical particle is a relative event. It turns out that we are best placed close to close the gap between absolute quantity and relative quality, not by explaining how it is that qualities can exist and in a quantitative world, but by appreciating the absolute quantities are actually relative qualities in disguise. So that's a tough one it's a long quote with a
Yeah,
lot of
yeah,
information in it, but I know let's
man.
have you open that up.
I thought I thought I wrote an accessible book, but that sounds pretty dense.
Well, it is, but
But it makes
this is
sense in
for the
context.
guys and
Yeah,
gals and
yeah.
persons out there that want to take a deeper dive and
Yeah, yeah. No, but also, there's a lot leading up to that. So, but yeah, you pulled out a cool idea, which only came to me during writing, actually. Like, because
okay.
I was, yeah, I was writing that section. I think it's a section called "Closing the Gap," where I think it's the longest
Hmm.
chapter, where I'm just like, I really want to pin down the different philosophical issues here. So it is the most technical and the most kind of trying to make sure I tie up all the loose ends. Um, yeah, so what happened there is I often do a thing, because I have a sincere desire to communicate to like people no matter where they're at to try and bring people along without any prior knowledge. So I'll often just do like a reset and be like, okay, like what am I thinking about here? Like what is like let's start again. Let's get rid of all the assumptions. What are we talking about? Because if you do that, you come at it from different angles and there's different kind of stories you can tell yeah, and insights you can have. And what happened there was I did that and I was like, okay, let's start again with like we think the world is like quantitative in that if I measure a table, I can measure and it's got like 100 centimeters, and you measure and it's the same. And physics is this kind of engagement with the world where it's like, all right, there's a mathematical structure here that's can be measured. And then I've got the taste of coffee and the smell of oranges and the blue of the sky. That seems qualitative. I can't measure like yeah, there is no number that you put on the taste of a coffee versus a different coffee. It's not quantitative in that way. So you're like, okay, well, what is equality? And then you mentioned the kind of a co-arising of opposites there. It's like, okay, well, up is up because it's not down. Hot is hot because it's not cold. We couldn't perceive hot without a capacity to perceive cold because, like, as it's getting less hot, well, that's the same thing as getting more cold, right? So, it comes back to this relational structure where I think matter is a kind of a process of interdependent. Things are co-defined as this web where everything is a relationship. There are only interactions and relationships, and I think the structure of the mind is the same, where it's like a house of cards where one experience is cashed out against another one, and you can, again, hot and cold, you can imagine. But I think everything is the fundamental one is kind of death being bad and life being good is like the first kind of meaning that we have. And then I think everything is kind of scaffolded on top of that. You can almost imagine like the trunk of a tree and then like a fractal structure of lots of different things being cashed out against each other. So now you've got this picture where you're like, okay, qualities are like relations. They're like a bit more of this, a bit less of that. It's not a strict quality of like 100 centimeter table. It's like we're moving in the direction of heart. It's not, it's like we're moving in this direction versus this direction. And I was like, okay, well, actually, I just told this story of like contents of consciousness are relations. And I actually said earlier in an earlier chapter that matter is relations. And so what's the difference? Like when I told that story of quantity, when I measured that table, what's actually happening there? Well, actually, given that we're all part of the same reality, I'm kind of saying from my perspective, or take the weight of something, it probably is easier to describe. If we say something weighs 100 pounds, really, you might say, okay, well, that's just an absolute quality of that thing. It's somehow intrinsic to it. Very simple. It has that weight. But actually, what I'm saying there is there's this relationship between the gravity of the Earth, me measuring it, the object. If you took it into space, it wouldn't weigh 100 pounds. 100 pounds. It wouldn't have that weight. So I was like, actually, that's the same thing. That's also relations. And we just slap this number on it as a way of saying, well, it's gone this much on that trajectory of that quality. And you could do the same thing with like, phenomenology. If you mapped out our spectrum of how much blue we could perceive in terms of its saturation, you could probably start to quantify it, and then that would be a quantity. So I had this experience again and again with writing the book, which made me feel like I was on the right track, where these seeming opposites kind of dissolved and were revealed to be language games over a coherent reality that's unitive, where actually the physical and the mental aren't truly separate. They are different. We can talk about them as different processes, but they're both, I would say, relations, or the same. This is why it's kind of neutral monism picture. So it's a way of kind of dissolving even that paradigm of thinking, well, how do qualities exist in a quantitative world? It's actually everything is both, you could say. In that way, I phrased it there. I say everything's qualitative, but what does that really mean? It just means it's relations. And again, non-conceptuality in the sense that our language is limited. We always have to be aware that we're always telling stories about a reality that is beyond the stories of it. So we shouldn't be too upset if we have to actually throw away a treasured concept like quality and quantity being genuinely separate things.
Yeah. And to the audience, I would suggest when you purchase this book, or if you purchase the book, that Closing the Gap will elucidate these ideas coherently. And like I said, it was revelatory for me. Because again, this is the big thing that they love to fight over, and qualitative versus, the hard problem that Chalmers presented, and you get branches of dealing, or ideas presented like illusionism, which I'm sympathetic to weak illusionism, but maybe not a la Frankish or Dennett. But that, as I think you address in the book, that we are not really whatever naive realism, that we're not directly in contact with the world. And so I've tried to dig deep into Frankish's work. Walter White has a book on the philosophy for the science of animal consciousness. I'm trying to get him on the show. I have this book, so we're close. And I'm trying to get Keith on too, because I think some of what he talks about, we may not be able to go convergent all the way down to the metaphysics or the physics, but the idea that they present, that there is the reactive schema, and then there is this sort of introspective, perceptual or affective perceptual kind of interpretation of what's going on. Does that kind of lends itself in a way? It?
So I think I agree with what you said, that I don't agree with all the details of the way that they think the illusion happens. I don't think it's an illusion, but I do think you could call this stance. It is compatible with, I think, the core spirit of illusionism is to say that consciousness doesn't exist as a separate thing to the processes that make up us. So as a conscious human, there's these biological processes, these physical processes, and there isn't this extra magical ingredient called consciousness. I 100% agree with that. I say in the book that I think the embodied dynamics of the living thing as it relates to the world, that relationship is consciousness. And sure, like you can observe that from an outside perspective, and I can feel what it feels like from the inside. So the book kind of explains, I guess, why you can have this like dual aspect to it. But yeah, so I guess I would say it comes back to the idea of emptiness and interdependence, where consciousness doesn't exist in the sense that it's something apart from the unfolding of the world. It codependently arises at the intersection of organisms and environments, I think, and just the
Mm-hmm.
totality. I mentioned the idea that the universe wakes up through us.
Mm-hmm.
The whole of existence comes together to create all phenomena. And that's true for literally everything. So nothing, that's why I started early on talking about objects not existing, like nothing can truly pull itself apart from the rest of the universe. And it's probably worth saying that, I think the popularity of idealism in spirituality is, in part, I can see why people are tempted towards it, but I think a big part of it is as you surrender. I mentioned like when you let go of those identity structures, it's groundless and it causes you to open up to painful things, even managing the past traumas and things. And so it's a very, very common thing to then, it's almost universal for a lot of people, I think, where there is a new self that's restructured, a much more expansive self. There is consciousness, is even the cosmic consciousness, but it somehow feels stable and solid. And, it's not this groundlessness of the strange, loopy, evolving unknowing of being
Mm-hmm.
that's empty and like, that I'm talking about. It's a lot easier to be like, no, there's this solid ground in it. Sure, it may be non-material, maybe consciousness rather than matter, but it allows you to have a mental paradigm of thinking that's really what reality is. Boxes in reality, it seems to. So that you can function instead of having to go really, really deep into the identity structures.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And one last thought on Frankish's work and illusionism is I like how he addresses qualia. He kind of he dismisses the metaphysical grounding of it, and tries to, and I may be putting words in his mouth, which is why I want to have him as a guest. Is it's a verbal kind of a qualia. So you're reading or you're painting
Mm.
or you're. So I like that because I think in one of the takeaways from your book and from other thinkers that I admire is that consciousness is a less of a noun. I'll be crude here. It's less of a
Yeah,
noun
yeah,
and more of a verb that we are consciousing, if that's the way to say it, rather
yeah,
than
definitely.
consciousness being that thing like Penrose and Hammer offer. It's in this loop right here in this little fold in the
Right.
tubules of a quantum structure or something. It's more
Yeah, you could say
that
so.
it's
The activity of knowing, believing, it's some
right.
activity of yeah, definitely.
And I love Vervaeke's adverbial qualia, the here-ness, the
Mm.
nowness. These are qualitative states that are accessible to us and not terribly controversial, I think. So
Right,
I
right.
want to give Keith, credit in that sense that, yeah, again, I can't go all the way down with some of the ideas being floated, but that's an admirable aspect. Let's see. So let me pull up another quote here, and let's see. We're just over an hour, so I think we're good on time. Let me find. Oh, let's see. Oh, there's something you address schools of thought on mm, dancing around consciousness, like Carl Friston's work with free energy principle. But there was, and you bring up
Right.
IIT, but there was one thing that I thought was interesting that maybe we could unpack, and it was right below your discussion of IIT. You talked about integrated world modeling theory of consciousness and the folks that work with that. Do you want to share that? That's a nice teaser that people can find out more about in the book. And
Yeah, so that's a researcher called Adam Safran who's yeah, he developed this fleshing out of kind of predictive processing theory of consciousness. It's very detailed, and yeah, based around I think the idea that if you want to, you need to account for kind of this emergence of a world of like a 3D space and time, the stage on which kind of our phenomenal experience of the world seems to play out. So in the book, I try to not step on people's toes who are doing, people like that are doing great work in terms of really fleshing out in the human brain, the complex as a whole. It's going to be a long research project to really map this stuff onto the brain. So I'm really dealing with starting with the kind of self-organization of life and looking in the direction of metaphysics in terms of the philosophy of like, how do we weave all this together? And I wanted to make sure I reference those people to say they're doing amazing work and, in taking this into the details of what's going on in the human brain and yeah, really get into nitty gritty. So I won't, I would recommend his papers are very long and
okay.
detailed and technical. So I'm not going to give a bad summary of it here, but
Yeah,
yeah, people like
yeah.
that are doing great work.
Can whet their appetite to explore that further.
Yeah.
And I noticed in IIT, which I never realized, I'm not really too keen on the details of IIT, but that you had mentioned in the book that they assign a kind of sentience to extended mind, to devices and things like that.
Right, right.
Is that a sort of tie back to panpsychism? Is there an element of that in there or where are they coming from when they want to assign a kind of sentience beyond computational and functionalist sentience, in that perspective?
Yeah, so I think it kind of falls out of the theory. So the theory began with, like the brain is this very integrated structure. I mean, the way it's presented begins with phenomenology of consciousness.
Hmm.
Um, and then it's like, okay, well, maybe it's something to do with that integration aspect. And I think the genius of IoT is, for me at least, is a particular step where I spoke about at the beginning, thinking about what it is to be a quasi thing that can say it's a thing, um, as being something you need to kind of reckon with. And it talks about how integrated something is in the sense that you're kind of like a non-reducible whole, like holism being an integrated whole. What does that, trying to quantify what that means? And I do think that's a kind of prerequisite to be a thing that can be conscious. So like by the kinds of dynamics I'm talking about, that I think, so I think consciousness is I mentioned kind of like a knowingness, like it's like so you could say we are like epistemic agents. We are these things that, we seem to arrive in the world and we seem to have this knowingness. We seem to be exploring ourselves and the world. And this epistemic quality, is just kind of philosopher's term for this knowingness of consciousness. And so why is that happening really is the question. And what I'm saying in the book is if you look at to be a self-organized living system, the only way to do that is to be an epistemic agent, is to try to engage in this informational terms with the wider world. And so I think if you keep it at that level, then you've got an explanation as to why consciousness exists. If you get into thinking it evolved, then you get into all like the heart problem and stuff.
Yeah.
But so those same dynamics, though, you can model it, like those same dynamics play out in evolution, like Darwinian evolution through species as a whole phenomenon is following that same process of that kind of epistemic process of like, you could say that the giraffe's neck carries information about the height of trees in its environment. It becomes a model of its niche. Like it's like a problem solving dynamic where the problem is what kind of thing can survive in this niche, and then the answer here is a giraffe. The answer here is a human, and so there is this same informational dynamic. But my instinct is that's not the process of evolution isn't conscious. And when I try and be precise about why that's my instinct, is because consciousness for us, at least, we're talking about it being a perspectival phenomenon, that I can talk about my consciousness from this perspective, you can from your perspective. That's something to do with being an integrated whole that self-maintains, I think. Whereas evolution, if you put some, we see this in the history of evolution, if some animals are isolated on an island, they can evolve independently. There is no coherent wholeness to the process of evolution where it can't be divided. Whereas if you cut me in half and put half of me on Mars, I'm not going to survive very long because I am this integrated whole. So I'd written a paper comparing, this process of knowingness I'm talking about is technically called inference, and so I wrote a paper about whether consciousness is integrated information or if it's inference, and then I made the kind of case that I'm saying now, that I think a certain level of integratedness is necessary as a prerequisite for consciousness, but it's not consciousness itself. And part of again, I didn't close what I think is genius about the IT thing is they say like you exist for yourself. Your consciousness exists for itself in the sense that if everyone else on Earth died, if all other living things died, that wouldn't change anything about the existence of my consciousness. No one needs to observe the consciousness of this body for it to exist. And so that's something to do with intrinsic existence. What is it to be a whole that can exist for oneself? And I think that's a clever way of thinking about this, like things that can be conscious issue. But so independently, Adam Safran had also written these papers basically in his theory saying that he thinks that IoT needs to be synthesized with this inference, predictive processing stuff. So that's probably why I include his work there. And Shimol Chandari as well, who does great work in this area, had given a talk saying basically the same thing. So we'd all kind of independently came to this conclusion, I think, that IoT serves a function, but it's like a foundational function in this narrative around what it is to be a thing that can infer, and to unpack the term inference, really, that just means it comes from the ancient Greek of to carry forward. And so, you have an inference where you have you have some information. So say you already know something and you get some new information, then you can infer something from that, come to some conclusion that you've not actually observed the thing you're concluding, but you can carry forward and generalize from that. So in ancient Greece they had these syllogisms of like, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. Or you could reverse it and say that all men are that men are mortal, and then you meet this guy called Socrates and you discover that he's a man. You've got this pre-existing belief, and then you discover some new data. Then you at that point you've never seen Socrates die, but you can generalize from that he will die. Mm-hmm. That's an inference. Mm-hmm. And so this is the kind of free energy principle stuff, which is to say that the brain with perception is always doing this, where it has a model of its kind of accumulated knowledge of what's going on in the world, what causes exist out there that give rise to sensory information. And then in every moment, as new sensory information is entering the system, it's combining those two to make exactly that kind of update of the inference of what's going on in the world. Mm-hmm. So there's this inference is always this kind of going beyond, and it's specifically about the hidden causes out there in the world that's giving rise to this flow of sensory information. And I first, when we look at how the brain works in that way, we typically, historically, there's this Bayesian brain hypothesis that, Bayes' theorem is the kind of mathematically optimal way to do this. And it was it was like, okay, well, this is the way the brain works, but there's a technical issue there, which is that in order to do exact Bayes' theorem, if I'm looking at a vertical line right now, to do that calculation, I actually need to know the probability of every single thing in the entire universe that could possibly cause that vertical line. Is it the edge of a palm tree? Is it the edge of a brick? Is it a piece of string? And there's no way to do that for a computer. People in AI face this problem as well. That's computationally intractable. It can't be done. So the free energy principle began as a kind of a clever hack of you actually just start with a guess, literally kind of any guess, and then update your guess based on how surprising the data is you're getting if it were the case that your guess was correct. So it's a bit like a game of 20 questions where it's like, you're thinking of an object. I think, okay, maybe it's an apple. And then I asked you, is it food? And you say yes. And I go, okay, that's not very surprising. If I'm right, that data isn't surprising. I'm going to stick with apple. And I keep going. And then I get to something when I say, can I, I'm losing track of what I say. It's food, right?
Yeah.
Say something where.
So maybe you ask a question about the color. Yeah. So you ask a question about the color, and I surprise you with
right. So right. So I was trying to get onto it's an airplane, but I was like, no, I've said it's food, so it can't be an airplane.
Right.
For future interviews, I'll work through an example before I do this on the phone.
Oh no, it's okay. But it's articulated in the book, and yeah.
But then you say you can make it into French fries or something, and I'm like, oh, okay, it's a potato, So that would be very surprising. You can't make out of an apple. So I radically update my guess. And with that strategy of having a guess and updating based on surprise, you can worm your way towards the right answer very effectively. So you can approximate Bayesian inference. So that was the model of what's going on in the brain. And then he came over the other way and was like, actually, this isn't a thing that only complex brains can do. Any self-organizing thing, the only way to anticipate and discount the destructive forces of the world is to do this process. And so I'd independently I'd came to the conclusion that basically the same insight that self-organization to keep yourself together over time, that kind of inference, that kind of perceptual reaching out needs to be happening. And then I ran to literature and was like, I need to figure out if anyone in the physics of life has been written about this. And I came across Carl Friston, who I was at the same university as. I knew his stuff on the brain. I was like, why is he writing about life and stuff? And then that's when I found this other road to his free energy principle. And that's when I got really excited, because I was like, if I spent the rest of my life trying to flesh out this stuff in formal language, I wouldn't be able to do it. He's really done something very impressive in his work. And I was like, oh wait, it's this is the same phenomenon that I'd intuited in its crudest form in terms of self-organization entails inference. And he's laid it all out here in all of his papers. So I cite his stuff. But the argument I still would have written the book even if the free energy principle didn't exist, because I think the story I'm telling, I think, makes sense. But I think if someone thinks this is an extension of the free energy principle, where they're you're taking this model and you're misinterpreting it, or you're doing something extra with it, that's not what this is. I think maybe I'm trying to guard off some criticisms that I can imagine people might misunderstand what I'm doing here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there are criticisms of FEP and predictive
Right.
processing, so it's going
Right,
to be
exactly.
come with the game, I guess.
I mean, the cool thing is though is that there's a core thing where the whole the whole point is that our situation as these epistemic agents is that the world is out of reach, and so we come up with inferences to the best explanation, and that's always provisional. We're always our knowledge our knowledge actually always opens up new niches for exploration. So the game never ends. We never come to a final fixed. Okay, we've got it. The snake never eats the whole
Hmm.
of its body.
Hmm.
It is this ongoing exploration. So the free energy principle, because the core of it is saying that this inference is built into our kind of what we are at the fundamental level. It's both saying, therefore, this theory will not be the final thing. It will be
Hmm.
critiqued and it will be modified. And so, in that sense, it can't be the correct truth. However, there's a level of harmony that's like, if that core claim is right, that totally makes sense of like, that's the core, I guess the core thing I'm saying is that if you understand this situation we're in of kind of trying of knowledge. I mean, it's not even knowledge. Really. I use the word believing in the book that
Hmm.
we never
Hmm.
actually truly know the state of the world. We're always coming up with guesses and beliefs and updating them. And if you then do the science and you go, hi, it looks like we're a thing that does this inference game, and you're like, oh, that makes sense why I'm doing this right now. That makes sense of why my consciousness is like this controlled hallucination. That makes sense of why philosophers are doing epistemology, and like it makes sense of why the phenomenal world is different to the noumenal world. Like suddenly there's this like emergent harmony that is the when you infer to the best explanation, you're not looking for some final like you know great, you got an A, you got it right. No, you're looking for an emergent harmony that's like, as I said with the 20 questions game, you're like, yes, yes, I'm on the right track. I'm on the right track here because
Hmm.
I'm getting the right
Hmm.
answers I'm expecting. Um, and so the fringe principle both is kind of contains within it the claim that it can't be the final truth, but it also seems to have touched on something which produces a level of transcendent harmony in our understanding of our situation that I would be shocked if the core of it was disproven. If it was like, oh, you know what? It was all an illusion. All that we thought it made sense of so much, it didn't actually. Like, I'd be very shocked if, if it was dismantled in that way. But yeah, there are lots of technical issues that mean that you wouldn't want to hang your hat on it as like in its current formulation that it's definitely 100% right.
Hmm. Well, in the public do or in the academic domain, it's free to be tweaked and worked with and
Right, right.
challenged, and yeah, and
And
to,
science is another part of this process of this evolutionary inference to the best explanation that's never ending. It's always provisional, it's always stories.
yeah,
And that's good to
yeah.
know about science. We're always telling stories that are always modifiable.
It almost speaks to that fractal scale invariant nature of you know other things that we've talked about, wherein you see it at the unicellular level, you see it at our level as we want to call ourselves advanced or higher cognitive agents, and also I think culturally. There's opportunity there for updating priors or active inference in a sense. I think it breaks down in a psychosocial or a larger cultural domain, but maybe small pockets, can do group kind of
Right.
calculating in that sense. So yeah, I think it's kind of interwoven with I don't think it's too controversial, but I'm an idiot. So what do
Yeah.
I know? A
Don't
relative
worry
idiot,
about
I'm not I'm not academically keen enough to try to pick it apart. But it just intuitively, as a folksy kind of guy, it seems like it has some merit and some weight. And
that. Yeah.
here's to the challenges, and maybe they can thresh it out. Only I hope to improve it, or build on it
Right.
better with another aspect or whatever it is that would come
Yeah.
along
Yeah.
to that. But yeah, I would say, and I'll get your opinion on this. You're a neuroscientist. That Friston's work has been monumental. I mean, it's just really opened things up and influenced a lot of people and had a big
Yeah.
impact.
I think he, as you might expect of someone claiming to have a principle that's a unifying theory of the brain, he put a target on his back, and a lot of people want to take him down. I think for that,
Mm,
in terms of, but again, people have sincere kind of criticisms as well. But so it's kind of divisive at the moment. There are people who catch the fever of it and are like, yeah, like we're really onto it here, and there are people who are not on board with it. So it'd be interesting to see, yeah, definitely how it shapes out over years to come. Um, yeah, he's definitely. I mean, quantitatively, to get back to that, he's
hmm.
the definitely the most influential neuroscientist alive today. I would say.
Mm, yeah, yeah, and again, in this little corner of the internet or whatever you want to call it, or academia, anybody I admire admires Friston and the work that he does, and that doesn't mean much, just
Means
emotionally
something.
or
Yeah.
anecdotally, but for good minds to be appreciating the work. And I think there's overlap with like the Jamesian definition of intelligence, where it's diverse problem solving. How do you problem solve? So we get to the core of
Right.
intelligence,
Right.
right? Again,
Yeah.
unicellular. How do you problem solve? Well, it's problem solving in a diverse environment, or aspectually problem solving. I mean, that speaks to that kind of updating of
Yeah. Yeah.
priors, and holding beliefs, non-conceptual beliefs or conceptual beliefs, and then forwarding them with updating, like you said, the apple to the potato, yeah,
Right.
or
Yeah. And
or the
I think part of the issue with it is that the I mentioned before that like when you've got a really good synthesis, sometimes things start to break down in that like the quantity quality thing. Like suddenly, like it's like the core of it is almost there's nothing there, and it gets so simple. Yet what spins out from it is so complex. So I think with the fringe principle, yeah, people kind of get intimidated, understandably, by that so much complexity can spin out of it, and so much richness. But actually, you can just start with a very simple linchpin idea. So if you link it to self-organization, the thing that the insight that I had as well was that, well, maybe I shouldn't phrase it that way, but so the way Friston phrased it, because I wasn't thinking about it in terms of surprise, but he says, he's like, if you're going to be a thing over time, if you're going to keep yourself together and keep yourself orderly, you better not be surprised. Like if you're constantly being caught off guard and like you're hit by a bus when you walk across the road, or like you're not going to survive, and that might feel kind of intuitively appealing. So, but this is also true for any self-organizing thing, whether it's like we could talk about so say there's like a shallow sea and there's like sands moving around and an island forms. We could talk about that. We could use the same language. Surprise we tend to think of as an agent like us that has ability to have beliefs about the world and then be surprised because we have some expectations, and that's how this initially began. But it turns out the math can be generalized to, we could talk about as if the desert island has surprise, and as long as we're clear that we're not saying that it actually does. Again, that comes back to the thingness. Isn't a thing for itself, so it wouldn't be able to. It's only a story we're telling about it. But yeah, so like if you're gonna not be surprised as a living thing, then the only way to do that is to be informed about what's going on, so you can expect what's going to happen. Like how else are you going to not be surprised? You need to anticipate, and the only way to anticipate is to have some idea of what's going on in the outside world. And that's that simulation that I think is consciousness, is that in us, is that ideating, simulating, believing epistemic quality of reaching out beyond the evidence to what we think is going on in the outside world. People talk about consciousness being like controlled hallucination. That's like the hallucination part, and then it's controlled by the sensory input. So you've got this model of the world that you're using to try to not die in every moment, and then it's coupled to the wider world, and that's allowing you, and it's updating with the feedback you're getting. And so you're existing by virtue of the fact that you're resonating. You're never actually in touch with those things out there in the world, but you're resonating with them in that over time. With if you take the Sandy Island example, if you had the ocean had really slow, really deep trenches that moved they produce very big, slow, oscillating waves. If you had a really tall, thin island, and that was somehow there's like a stack of sand that was like remaining there, I think most people look at that and go like, "That's weird. Like, how's that? That doesn't fit. Like, why is all these big, slow waves coming, and somehow this very tall, thin stack of sand is still there?" Like, and that intuition is correct. So the island, if we think of it by analogy like the organism, its structure comes to mirror the structure of the deep trenches of the ocean. By analogy, it's like the waves are like sensory input and the shifting sands are like motor output, like in the same way that we sense and then we behave. Those same mathematical principles, you can say it looks as if the sand believes something, it has information about the shape of the bed of the ocean. And again, this points back to, well, that shouldn't be so surprising in a world that isn't fundamentally, isn't true separation. There's resonances like that can happen. So the cool thing with the theory is it started out about brains, then it was generalized to life, but then it was generalized to all things that can be different, or I guess what I would call quasi things that we can look at and go, well, that's the thing because it has, over time I can say that's distinct from its background, and I can like draw a line around it, and there's some structure there. So even like there's this thing, if you put two pendulums on the same shelf and swing them, they'll synchronize over time. Same thing, you can model that where it's as if, in the same way that like a fox chasing after a rabbit in an environment, they're two agents interacting with each other. The same modeling you can do as if the pendulums are kind of anticipating and acting on each other through vibrations in the shelf. So again, I don't want to say, this is why you bring in the kind of IAT wholeness thing, where like, I don't want to say the pendulum actually is having a conscious experience, but it shows you that the dynamics that we think underlie consciousness in the brain from the kind of predictive processing approach, the core physical dynamics, there's a story we can tell where they're continuous with all forms, all adult, and this is scale free. So anytime something structured emerges, it's got that, if you want to, you could call it like proto consciousness to emphasize that it's really, it's not consciousness, but I think it's that relational dynamic that lays the foundation for consciousness. So now we do have a good story, I think, about why consciousness is continuous with the physical world. Compare that story with, especially if you pair it with the relationality thing, the relational interpretation of physics. But you compare that story with like Newtonian mechanics, you've got these little billiard balls bumping around and then you've got the taste of coffee, and that's a qualitative experience. How the heck do those match together? Your story has a big gap in it. Like they don't play very nicely. The story I just told, I think they play quite nicely. And we can, when you look at it this way, you're like, okay, where is the problem here? I don't, suddenly I think the hard problem doesn't seem to rear its head.
Yeah, and that supports the pendulum example supports the idea that I have an affinity towards when I think about things is the continuity in that. And I had the honor of having John Vervaeke on recently, and I was like, right at the threshold of life, non-life, and you cover a lot of this in your book, and it's rich, and I appreciated reading it because it gave me new perspective. But yeah, I look at that moment when we see life, whatever, arise, emerge, happen. But there's a history behind that of self-organization and complexification through that or organization, however you want to frame that, and so that. Talking about the influence that one system has on another supports that continuity without infusing pixie dust or magic and saying, well, at the moment that abiogenesis occurred, something really magical like consciousness, interceded.
Right, which is why I'm saying it's not something separate to the process. I just think that it's a word we use for a certain way of relating that has this quality that we would call knowingness, believingness, epistemic, whatever. There's something here where there's some informational dynamic going on. Yeah, but it's not something separate to that flow.
And weaving two thoughts together from your book, when we talk about free energy principle and active inference, is that he addresses entropy and entropic states and dissipative states. And that these autopoietic, if we will, systems, the biopsychic autopoietic systems, are resisting that. I know negative entropy is kind of a dated term, but we're maybe negentropic systems, and that in cognitively or in a psychic, and I use psychic as psychological or mental states.
I know what you mean. Yeah. I was going to use that word earlier, but I didn't because I had the same anxiety.
I disclaim a lot. Yeah. I'm not talking about tea leaf reading and tarot cards here. I'm just talking about the psychological states that reduction of surprise, like you said, and information minimization to reduce the entropy, the high entropy that can arise again from the high influx of possibilities and things like that is well covered in your book. And so I wanted to let the audience know that that's available in the book as well. And again, it helped me broaden frame to look at things that way. So I appreciate that about your book. We've come up, we're bumping into about an hour and a half, and I do want to cover, I'm not going to read anything but one more comment, I think, here, because I said I had that summative comment, and we can certainly, it's rich. Right. So, okay, so this is the summative comment that I thought really, again, if for the audience, it's so your quote here is, the story I've told should sit well with physicalists, as consciousness is held to be nothing but a certain arrangement of physical processes. It is not something truly distinct from the operation of the physical world. It should satisfy panpsychists, as the essence of mind, relationality, does indeed exist in matter, which could be said to possess a kind of proto-consciousness, as you just said a second ago, in the sense that it provides a foundation out of which consciousness can emerge, but not one that by itself possesses the capacity to experience. And idealists should also be happy with this view, as it is one where there is no solid material substance in existence, and the essence of consciousness, both its formless ground and the relational forms that we experience as its content, is what reality is made of. And I didn't trip over my tongue on that, so a little pat on the head there for that. But yeah, I like that summative statement, because your book is a synthesis project in a sense that you are working with that, what I would consider maybe a false dilemma or a false dichotomy of the hard problem of consciousness, and your argument presented in the book, as we were talking about couple of different examples. I want to talk about the model maybe for a second too. Like, there is being a model, and then there's a model that is, derived of conceptual, quantitative
Right.
measurements and things like that. So do what you will with the marrying of seemingly disparate camps or thoughts, through physicalism,
Yeah, yeah.
panpsychism, and idealism.
Yes, this comes back to the non-conceptuality that we started with, where I always see these things as maps rather than territory itself. The territory is ineffable and yeah, can't be encompassed by ideas about it. So I think I was always comfortable not firmly being like, well, I'm a panpsychist or I'm a, this. So
Mm-hmm.
instead seeing they all have things to offer. And they're all trying to describe, yeah, a truth that is articulated from different perspectives. So I could totally, and I just hearing you read it back to me that I'm saying it should satisfy you. Like,
Well,
feel free to not be satisfied.
you say that in a kind of
say.
like unitive, like
Yeah,
let's come together and we have our
yeah, yeah.
disagreements,
Not telling
but
people
yeah,
they should.
yeah, yeah,
But yeah, like shut up if you don't like it. But
yeah.
yeah, my point is that I could tell a story. I could be like, today I'm an idealist, and let me tell you exactly the same picture with using different language, and that language would. So if I was an idealist, I would say something like, we only ever directly know consciousness, and reality is made of relationality. But what is relationality really? It's the same thing we're using. If this consciousness is also relationality, why not generalize the word consciousness to it? And so it's made of the same thing as my consciousness. You could do it that way. I think it could be a bit misleading because again, I don't think there's experience there. But so yeah, that's my point, is that you can tell it in different ways that give different flavors. But again, that synthetic quality of like things coming together really, as I started to see again and again these connections as I was fleshing out the details, gave me the feeling that I was onto something, that there's like a coherence here that, yeah, could be I'm not just trying to be like, here's another theory, in the same way you've got the microtubules, right, in the York thing you mentioned before. I'm not saying, oh, well, actually, it's a cerebellum. Like, I think it's this structure, or I think it's this,
Right, like
like
Mark
I'm not
Solms.
gonna,
Yeah.
it's just gonna, well, I mean, his stuff does synthesize with my stuff as well.
Right, and you
Yeah,
you
and he
you
thinks it's
credit
brain
him in the
stems.
book. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, so yeah, his stuff fits nicely, I think. But yeah, so I'm not just being like, I've got my own like egoic like project of being a
Yeah.
theory of consciousness. Hopefully, it's a
The
genuine
Cookean,
contribution.
yeah.
Yeah, you're right, exactly.
Cookisms. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone has to be my follower, and yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do hope that people. I mean, it's not so much that. Yeah, I guess if there's one thing I could communicate is that. I mean, I guess it's what awakening is, which is discovering the concepts are not reality, and that you don't need to be so attached to and entrenched in a certain conceptual lens. And there's a lot more freedom and play to be had when you soften your attachments to concepts. And this is an unfolding discovery process, as I described with the kind of inference picture. So yeah, that idea of inquiry, of like, as I was writing the book, there was this like, I could feel like almost like a bodily tension of like inhabiting my own perspective and trying to stake out the best I can, like this particular perspective. And then once the book was done, there was a relaxing, which probably led to the concussion, but like to the point where like, as I'm writing the book, I'm like, I think idealism is wrong for these reasons. And I'm really articulating that point.
Hmm.
Now I'm kind of excited to talk to idealists in a spirit more of like, could we be saying the same thing, even though I don't personally resonate with the language? Yeah, so I guess that's that spirit of collaboration and inquiry and respect for seemingly conflicting opinions, because they may actually not be conflicting.
Well, I think it's refreshing that somebody wants to cover overlap and not so much the arguments and points, counterpoints, and all these kind of things, but just seeing overlap in that and what people are doing. Which is why I've warmed up to what Frankish is doing and Walter White, and you know that they have something to lend. And again, you don't have to go all the way. Same thing with idealism. I've had
Right,
Bernardo
right.
Kastrup on multiple times, and I absolutely, and he helped me a lot with weaning myself out from probably more spurious ideas about what consciousness is or what theogenesis might look like, or you know all these things, and to come down to a more, you know, for me it's all epoche. Like you know, I'm agnostic, not
Yeah,
agnostic, I'm
yeah,
agnostic. You know, I just don't know. And in that space, I create a lot of freedom. It's the apophasis. You know, I can just sort of, you know, be more of a negating, but also cataphatic too, and go oscillate. So yeah, it just
yeah.
it gives you a perspectival lensing that I think is
But I think,
crucial.
ironically, when to think, to be obsessed with pinning everything down perfectly and knowing it is to have the illusion of being the head of the snake eating its own tail, and to then be
Right.
trapped in that frustration of never being able to fully do it because you think your concepts can do something they can't, which is to encompass reality, like putting the ocean in a thimble. Whereas, ironically, the moment you settle back into that unknowing of being comfortable not knowing, that's when you're really in touch with that resonance and the emergent harmony I mentioned before, where you get the signature of like, huh, like I know I'll never know for sure, but I really feel like I'm onto something, like we're onto something here, and you can start to kind of vibe with it in a way that I think that's what true knowing is that being comfortable with the limitations of our situation. But without those limitations, I think there would be some kind of cathartic resolution where the snake would eat its own tail and nothing would be happening.
Hmm.
There's some little like slip in our situation that leads to this like interesting, epistemic quality of the going out, the emergence, the eternal blossoming of reality.
Hmm.
So we shouldn't be in such a rush to consummate it and have it all be done with.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Again, that goes back to not quite instant gratification, but this sense of urgency to resolve. And I think that maybe
Right.
ties into an existential crisis or something to that effect
If the
that we
person
have
wants
to
to get out
have.
of the room by themselves, they want to just like give me the shock and get it done with, and then we can move on.
Right, right, because it's just it's a hell to, you know, to be in that space. And I get that. I mean, not so much me being, I can go out in the woods and be by myself and not have too much of a problem. But yeah, it is uncomfortable to be this tiny little thing on a tiny little planet in a tiny little star system, and just the overwhelming magnitude of what reality is, and trying to process. That's how religions arise. You know, they were trying to make sense of all of
Right.
this. And so, you know, I think hopefully we're reaching a level of cultural maturity and perhaps wisdom maturity that's, you know, that can emerge into society at large,
Right.
that we can address in a healthy, non-pathological way, and
Yeah.
without
Yeah.
corruption,
Right.
these
Yeah. So
questions.
another way of looking at a few of the things we've spoken about is that being comfortable with the not being certain is a level of openness, like receptivity. If you
Hmm.
don't think you've got it all figured out, you're really willing to hear, you're open. That I think that project of opening to oneself again. That's why in the room, the homeostatic opening of being with yourself and then challenging material coming up. That's why people flee from that, I think. But if you do that project and you learn to discover that your deepest nature is a kind of openness, I think the kind of the mystical, the contemplative like insight can come that reality itself is kind of grounded in a kind of boundless generative openness, and you can really align with that. And that to me, that's the path. Like that's the way in a human lifetime uh, to align yourself with reality and to suffer less as a result.
Hmm. Hmm. And I just had a Freudian cheat slip out on me. I said I could go out into the woods and be just fine by myself, but I wouldn't be by myself. I'd be surrounded by some of the greatest friends I've
Right.
ever had by plants, you know.
Yeah,
Darn.
yeah.
I tried to cheat out, but I think I could sit in a
Nice.
room for 10 minutes and not go mad. I mean, you
Yeah.
know me, I'm kind of a spaz and I like to talk, but yeah, I think I could ride out 10 minutes. But
I
going
write
in
in the book
nature
about
is not a punishment.
yeah, I write about plant blindness in the book. The idea that we
Yeah.
receive the natural world into some kind of background scenery. So yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, no, that was my first love before I found philosophy and all the things that come, you know, with it, with cognitive science and neuroscience and all these things. And in my backyard, I have this lab, and like I have these stick cuttings that I made from mango trees, and
Oh,
these little
nice.
sticks are turning back into trees again. And it's nothing magical about it, but it's just amazing that the plant, the stick that was part of a tree, is now wanting to be a tree again. And
Yeah, yeah.
they will, out of 31 cuttings, I think maybe three of them are turning back into plants again. I love that kind of thing. It's like they're doing their thing. And as you said in the book, if you look at stop motion of vines, they're
Right.
looking, in their own way for a place to latch
Yeah, there
on
are
to.
people doing these studies on like plant intelligence and stuff.
Yeah,
But yeah, it
like
depends on how you define magical, when it comes to the the phenomenon of life. Because yeah, nothing supernatural, but I mentioned
yeah,
that sense of aliveness and freshness and awe that can
yeah.
dawn in experience. And yeah,
Oh
sometimes
yeah.
you might want to call that magical.
Oh yeah, mystical. I am a hard-headed agnostic and I'm a non-theist, but the mystical, and
Yeah,
I
yeah,
want you back. I want to have you back, and we can talk about
yeah. I'd love to.
spirituality and the sacred and the mystical because, like you, I want to ground it. I don't because, as Vervaeke says, it's a two-world mythology, and we don't need that. If it can
Yeah,
be
yeah,
experienced or conceived or abstract in abstract thought, it doesn't need to be in a separate category. So yeah,
yeah.
let's look at that because that's something I think could deserves more time and attention because that's another
Definitely.
way
Yeah, yeah,
to heal the collective psyche of our
yeah,
population
yeah.
of the world.
Well,
So
yeah. I
yeah.
mean, I've absolutely loved both of our conversations, so I'm happy to
Oh,
come
well,
back
thank
anytime.
you. Thank you. For coming from you, I deeply appreciate that because like I said, I'm just an average guy. I don't have any
Yeah,
background,
I think you do
but
yourself down. I think you've clearly
oh,
you
well,
clearly
I'm
know what you're talking
obsessive.
about.
Like I'm hyperactive and I have an obsessive person, which is a psychic injury from the past, but I'm channeling it in the right way. So my
Yeah,
demons are
yeah.
working for me. But yeah, I
Right,
just
right, right.
and this work is an existential salve for me. Like when I read your book and
Right.
I look into the work of Kastrup or any Vervaeke or any of these guys, even Imagocris and the way they and Mark Vernon, he's got a new book coming out. So yeah, just all these people that are working on sense making
Yeah,
so anyway, James, it's been an absolute pleasure having you. It's your book has been revealing and a pleasure to read. So I want to thank you for that, and to the audience, I want to thank you all for your time and attention. And again, you've heard me advocate for his book, and I think it's a worthwhile expenditure of your time to explore the book. So, and again,
great.
we will have you back on. I know you have a book to work with, so maybe spring of next year we can get you back
That'd
in
be great.
once the things settle in a little bit from the
Yeah, yeah,
release of your book. Yeah, and hopefully a
yeah,
lot of speaking engagements and things like that. So, all
yeah.
right.
Thank you.
Any last thoughts before we close this one out? Anything else you want to share before we close this out?
No, I mean, I think we covered a lot, but yeah,
Yeah,
just
we did.
appreciate the invite, and it's great talking to you.
Oh, well, thank you, James. It was a pleasure having you as a conversation partner. So I will say goodbye to you after I stop the record, but to the folks in the audience, thank you again for your time and
Yeah,
attention. If you have any comments, put them down and I can any questions or anything. And I will have a lot of James's socials and website and access to the book and things like that down in the description field of the video. So take care, everyone. Thank you.